This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and welcome to episode 370 of the FCPA Compliance Report. In this episode, I have back my good friend and colleague Carlos Ayres. Carlos is a lawyer in Sao Paulo focusing on anti-bribery, anti-corruption. He takes us through the 3 or 4 significant highlights from the Brazil enforcement season in 2017, gives us some predictions about where compliance and enforcement may be going in Brazil, and given that Brazil had the largest number of companies that sustained FCPA enforcement actions in 2017, helps us understand what U.S. companies who do business in Brazil and indeed throughout Latin America can not only expect from enforcers, but also steps they can take to help prevent, detect, and remediate any compliance issues which arise. It's a fascinating exploration of anti-bribery, anti-corruption enforcement outside of the United States, and right now in one of the hottest areas for such enforcement, with a person who is very knowledgeable and has practiced in the area for many years. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, back for another episode. Today, I'm extraordinarily pleased to have with me my good friend and colleague, Carlos Ayres. Carlos is a partner at the firm of Medea, Ayres and Sarubbi in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He is one of the people that I look to talk about not only what's happening in Brazil, but most importantly for the U.S. audience, what that means for U.S. companies. So, Carlos, with that introduction, welcome and thank you for taking the time to visit with me today.
Hi, Tom. It's always a pleasure to participate on your podcasts.
So, Carlos, I don't think it would be unfair to say that the country of Brazil had as significant a year in anti-corruption as any other country on the globe. Certainly, it started in 2016, but 2017 was equally significant. We certainly had, I believe, the world's largest ever anti-corruption settlement with JBF, but lots of other things went on. So what were some of the highlights for you or highlights that you talked to your clients about?
Thank you, Tom. We continue to have important developments in Brazil. There is a very significant one, not from 2017, but very significant, which is that on January 24, 2018, an unanimous 3-judge panel of the Federal Court of Appeals upheld criminal conviction against former President Lula for bribery-related offenses. And the court also increased his sanction to 12 years of incarceration. So Lula will likely file appeals, but he might be arrested very soon. And he's also a defendant in other criminal case. And the judge of the Federal Court of Appeals mentioned that no one is too high to be above the law. And I think that sends a strong message to society and to people in general here in Brazil. The second thing I would highlight is that last year in August, the 5th Chamber of Prosecutors, which is of Federal Prosecutors, which is the body of the Brazilian Federal Prosecution Service dedicated to providing integration and coordination in the fight against corruption, who are also the body responsible for ratifying leniency agreements signed by federal prosecutors. They issue guidelines number 7 of 2017 on leniency agreement for Brazilian federal prosecutors. And the guidelines formalize in a written document some practice that federal prosecutors have been adopting in settlement negotiations they sign in bribery-related case. And the guidelines are welcome because they provide helpful information for companies and lawyers negotiating their first settlement agreements with prosecutors. The third point I would highlight is the imposition of a monitor in Brazil in bribery case. This is a new concept here, and the cases in which a monitor was appointed until the recent past were related to matters involving the DOJ and SEC, such as the Embraer, Braskem, and Odebrecht. And in the lenience agreement of JBS from June last year, which was signed with federal prosecutors in Brazil only, it includes this concept of external monitor, which is referred in the lenience agreement as an external auditor to monitor the compliance with the terms of the agreement. This is the first monitor imposed on a Brazilian matter for bribery case. It's not possible to say it's a trend, but prosecutors have said that they like this concept of having an external monitor. So I would expect to see monitors being imposed on more serious cases in Brazil. Excuse me. The fourth point that I think it's noteworthy is that new legislation is coming up requiring compliance in public procurement. So, for example, the state of Rio de Janeiro, which is one of the most important states in Brazil, passed a law in October 2017 requiring companies to have compliance programs when they participate in certain public procurement. So, for example, if they sign contracts with more than 180 days of execution and above $500,000 US for construction or engineering work, or above $220 US for goods and services, the company has either to inform that it has a compliance program or that it's going to implement it in 180 days after signing the contract. In failing to comply with that, might subject the companies to fines. On one hand, that's a welcome development because it incentivizes the implementation of compliance programs, but it's not structured in a very good way. So people who might evaluate the compliance program, which is the manager of the contract at this public entity, might not have the right expertise. The federal district passed a similar law at the end of last year as well. And at the federal level, there is also a draft bill that also addresses it, but that draft bill requires certification. So the company must have a certification beforehand as a condition to participate in the tender. And under that draft bill at the federal level, this would apply for public procurement above 30 million reais, which is around 10 million US dollars. And the company should have a certified program from an accredited entity. So this is something that's coming up more recently. I would finally highlight a fifth development that I think it's important, which is related to commercial bribery. which stands for the National Strategy Against Corruption and Money Laundering, which is a forum in which dozens of authorities participate, including federal prosecutors, federal police, the CGU, the Brazilian Securities and Exchange Commission, the Association of Federal Judges, and others. One of the actions approved by ENCLA in the end of last year was to elaborate proposals to fight commercial bribery and private corruption. And this was a suggestion that was presented by civil society. And as a result of it, we should expect a draft bill in 2018 criminalizing commercial bribery and private corruption in Brazil. And given, with respect to companies, given that there is no corporate criminal liability in Brazil except for environmental related case, companies might also expect a bill that will hold them liable for commercial bribery under civil and administrative liability. Apart from that, I would say that we continue to see strong cooperation internally and at the international level. New rules to fight corruption and money laundering have been passed. So, for example, the IRS issued a new rule in November last year saying that legal entities and individuals should inform the IRS if they receive amounts in cash above 30,000 reais, around 10,000 US dollars. And some say that this is a result of the bribery case that we have been seeing. And in September 2017, for example, the federal police found 51 million reais, around 17 million US dollars in cash, in an apartment related to a former minister who is currently in jail. So if we look also at the number of suspicious activities report, they have been increasing over the years. In 2017 alone, COAFI, which is our financial intelligence agency, received more than 1,500,000 SARS. So I think this summarizes what's going on in Brazil and what happened last year.
So, Carlos, one of the things I think American companies struggle with is not the aggressiveness of the Brazilian prosecutors, but their continued moving forward without a lot of guidance. But it sounds like to me that now the government has issued some guidance which may allow companies to put the right sorts of policies and procedures in place. Would that be fair?
Well, the Brazilian government, they issue some guidance in the recent past. So some years ago, the CGU issued guidance on compliance programs, and they published that even in English. So I strongly advise U.S. companies doing business in Brazil to look at that guidance, because the scope of the Brazilian anti-bribery law is broader in some aspects than the FCPA. So it's important to look at the specifics. So that was a helpful guidance. On that guidance that was issued last year by the Fifth Chamber of Federal Prosecutors, that's also a welcome guidance, because it provides helpful information for companies and lawyers about which prosecutors to go, give some clarity in terms of the process that will be followed. So I think the government is trying to give more, and the authorities are trying to give more clarity about the expectations that companies, for companies in terms of what to expect for their compliance programs and what to expect when they apply for a leniency agreement.
So, Carlos, in terms of what U.S. companies, or really any company outside of Brazil, should expect, what sort of advice are you giving?
Well, one important thing to keep in mind is that the level of sophistication of the Brazilian authorities increased a lot in the last years in terms of expertise in bringing case or in evaluating compliance programs. So if one company is to sit in front of the Brazilian authorities to explain what they have in terms of compliance, what they did in terms of remediation, it's important to keep in mind that companies should expect to get the same or very similar questions that the DOJ and the SEC makes, or for example, when the potential issue was discovered, what was done to mitigate risk, what was done to preserve data, when the data preservation was done. So that's one aspect to keep in mind. Another aspect, as I mentioned earlier, is that the scope of the Brazilian law is different from the FCPA. So it covers, for example, fraud in public procurement, even when they are not related to bribery. And that's an area of concern. And many times, employees, they commit wrongdoing, not because they want to violate the law, but because they do not know that certain specific practice is not permitted. So it's important to increase training and policies and procedures covering that area, and make sure that the policies that apply to Brazil are not only FCPA focused, because if a company is to present it to the authorities at a given point, they will look at the specifics of the Brazilian law. And that's highlighted also on the guidance that CGU issued.
So, Carlos, I'd like to maybe take up in a separate podcast some of the initiatives from other countries of Latin America, because we had the opportunity to visit about some of the very exciting things that are going on really continent-wide. But I would, from my perspective, it really appears that Brazil is leading South America in the fight against bribery and corruption, and the work of the Brazilian prosecutors, the work of people like yourself as outside counsel and consultants to companies, and the work of in-house compliance practitioners have put Brazil and Brazilians really in a place to lead this effort. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I think that's a fair statement on for different reasons. If you look more recently, Argentina passed a new anti-bribery law, which holds company liable for bribery of public officials. And in many aspects, that law is very similar to the Brazilian Clean Companies Act. If you look at the factors taken into consideration when applying the sanctions, they are very similar. The prohibited acts are very similar. So I think the Brazilian law was used in a model in many aspects. But this is not a recent trend, I would say. So in 2014, for example, when Peru was considering a new anti-bribery law in order to fulfill the commitments of the OECD. The Brazilian CGU provides some guidance to the Peruvian government. I was myself invited to attend a meeting in Peru to discuss with the authorities and civil society about the Brazilian law. And so hopefully not only the example of the legislation is going to be adopted by these other countries, but also that enforcement becomes a strong factor in these countries as well.
Well, Carlos, this has been a fascinating visit about kind of a retrospective over the past several months in Brazil. I want to thank you for taking the time to visit with me. I've been visiting with Carlos Ayres from Medea, Ayres and Sarubbi in Sao Paulo about really Brazilian anti-corruption efforts over the past year plus, because we did go into a little bit into 2018. Carlos, I want to thank you and look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thank you, Tony. It's always a pleasure. Looking forward to keeping in touch.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. If you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. If you have listened to this podcast on iTunes, I would greatly appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and help get the word out about the oldest podcast in compliance. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the FCPA Compliance Report. I hope you'll join us again next week, where we explore another topic in FCPA compliance. The FCPA Compliance Report is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network.